Okay, so folks, you're really what you just saw with all the damage to all those watermelons and ribs is uh, an attempt to dispel a lot of confusions, and I'm going to explain to you why. And I'm going to admit to you right up front, this is one of those areas where I know my knowledge needed to increase, my experience needed to increase, and this was an endeavor to flatten the learning curve on this entire subject. Why was this? Why did I consider this to be so confusing? Well, there's a lot of people that I do have a degree of respect for that have knowledge in this area that say different things. And in other words, you have your advocates of slower, faster, bigger, heavier bullets are the right choice, and then you have folks that now the velocity is everything. And none of these things, when it comes to handguns, are everything. If you can put enough velocity behind almost anything, you can get the sort of effects that we got with, say the AR 15.223 or the 12 gauge slug. If again, those are both velocity heavy. And in the case of the 12 gauge slug, just a big heavy projectile. But the 223 is a light, small diameter, like a 22 sort of projectile. You got a lot of these contradictions that when you think one way, all of a sudden you find out there's a different way that kind of sort of seems to trump that, and you keep going, and frankly, it just continuously got more and more and more confusing. I had some friends who were saying no. Bigger, faster, and it just kind of all over the place. And then when you start taking a look at all the ammunition options, and one manufacturer, making 8 or 9 different kinds of 9mm ammunition, or even more these days, and it gets confusing. What's the best choice for me? And short of the decoration on the outside of the box. Some of these things are hard to make choices from. Here's what I was personally wanting to see out of this test: is I was wanting to see actual destruction of all of these calibers in a media that would have the contents of a typical threat. And a typical threat, for me, would normally come in human form, although not always. I live in Wild Kingdom, and we do have some animals out here who think that humans are not at the top of the food chain, and so those things are possible. Did we get answers? Yes, we got answers, and I think that we got sufficient experience in order to put the calibers and the ammunition specifically that we tested in an order of effectiveness for these 11 calibers. We're going to present that to you here very shortly. However, this test also, along with answering some questions, it also made more questions in some other ways. And I don't feel like we can really stop here. So if you were just watching this for the exploding watermelons and like that, stay tuned, because we're not finished with that, because I think we do necessarily have to go back and take a look at a couple of other things. We'll be explaining that here in just a moment. I'm going to ask you, stay with us. Intake some information and some thoughts that may really flatten the learning curve for you about these same subjects if you are like me and have confusion about what is the most effective kind of ammunition or caliber for my choices. We all do want to be optimal ultimately if we are faced with a life and death situation where we must get that handled. All right. First, a few basics, and these are from yours truly. The ability to deploy the defensive firearm fast. The ability to deploy and utilize one-handed, since statistically it's more likely that if you ever have to utilize for example, a concealed carry handgun in a defensive situation, statistically, it's more likely you will need to deploy one-handed and utilize one-handed because your other hand may have something else to do. The ability to deliver accuracy and the ability to deliver fast and accurate follow-up shots in whatever quantity is required until the threat changes positions in the sights. A threat going from vertical to horizontal would be an example of a desirable change, and no caliber can help if these abilities are absent or deficient. So you take a look at the importance of these abilities: deholstering practice, dry firing practice, analyzing your defensive strategies, how you carry. Can I deploy one-handed? How accurate can I deploy fast one-handed and deliver accurate shots? Can I control this handgun? Can I control this caliber? Because as we saw in the very beginning of this study, Stacy Lim with the LAPD showed that it is possible to take a chest shot from a .357 Magnum, live, run the guy down, shoot him, kill him, recover, and go back to work. So, first of all, we all want to try to understand that the ballistics of a handgun round are always going to be insufficient to count on one-stop shots, unless you are lucky enough to get a shot that does penetrate the brain or penetrate a spinal cord. Even heart, lung, these types of shots, people have persisted long enough after shots like that in order to kill many times multiple people before they finally bled out. So again, the psychology behind handguns can never be, I'm going to make one shot and it's going to be like in the movies, and this is going to be clean, the person is going to fall to the ground and the threat's going to be over, and I'm going to go home and eat dinner. It doesn't happen that way. Statistically, think about this. To incapacitate, this is not talking about psychological incapacitations, this is talking about physiological incapacitations. There's one study that says a .45 ACP averages 2 to 3 rounds. The .40 Smith & Wesson averages, I think, 3 to 4 rounds. A 9mm averages 5 to 7 rounds. Now, that, is kind of a generalized rule that is not going to hold true in every case, or maybe even many, but it is a good illustrator. And this information was taken based on actual shootings and how many times it took, for example, like law enforcement to make a threat stop. And so, but the important thing is to understand is, most likely that's never going to be a one-shot proposition. You've got to be mentally expecting to deliver until the threat has decided to stop. So I wanted to share with you a question that came in an online forum, and this is now years ago. If I'm not mistaken, I did 10 years ago, actually. A gentleman wrote in and he said, help me understand. I see several types of hollow points from different calibers penetrate just as far as others. Some also penetrate less, but with much more energy. Take Corbon's 135 grain 10mm round. It only penetrated 10.5 inches, but with over 700 foot-pounds of energy. 165 grain 40 Golden Sabers penetrate around 14 to 16 inches, but with only 480 foot-pounds. Which is more important? Okay, I thought that was a great question. So first thing I wanted to cover is, how is this bullet energy in foot-pounds actually calculated? Here's the equation. Foot-pounds per second times foot-pounds per second, or foot-pounds per second squared, times bullet weight in grains. Then divide that result by 450,240, and you have foot-pounds of energy. And that's how our foot-pounds of energy was calculated on all of those calibers that you saw on the chart. As is the rule when it comes to physics, we don't consider extraneous factors like aerodynamics, gravity, and what you had for lunch for the sake of keeping the equation manageable. All right, the rest of the information here is attributable to a gentleman that wrote on that online forum 10 years ago. His name is Frank Etten. I give him credit for this. He brought several studies and information from studies to answer this question, and the first one is, the much discussed shock of bullet impact is a fable. The critical element in wounding effectiveness is penetration. The bullet must pass through the large blood-bearing organs to be sufficient diameter and be of sufficient diameter to promote rapid bleeding. Given durable and reliable penetration, the only way to increase bullet effectiveness is to increase the severity of the wound by increasing the size of the hole made by the bullet. So, okay, big hole, and then again, we're talking handguns here. Big hole, yes, seems to have advantages here. So that's one, I think, fundamental basic we saw in our testing in our study, and it continues here with this gentleman's reference. I see several types of hollow points from the different calibers penetrate just as far as others. And by the way, if you're only shooting into Jello, that is true. Some also penetrate less, but with much more energy, which is more important, penetration. This is kind of a long read, but pretty much covers the ground. Let's consider how shooting someone will actually cause him to stop what he's doing. The goal is to stop the assailant. There are 4 ways in which shooting someone stops him. Psychological. I'm shot, it hurts, I don't want to get shot anymore. Massive blood loss, depriving the muscles and brain of oxygen and thus significantly impairing their ability to function. Breaking major skeletal support structures and damaging the nervous system. So there's 4 possible ways that a defensive shooting may stop an assailant. Depending on someone just giving up because he's been shot is iffy. Probably most fights are stopped that way, but some aren't, and there are no guarantees. Breaking major skeletal structures can quickly impair mobility, but if the assailant has a gun, he can still shoot, and it will take a reasonably powerful round to reliably penetrate and break a large bone like the pelvis. Hits to the central nervous system are sure and quick, but the CNS presents a small and uncertain target. And sometimes significant penetration will be needed to reach it. The most common and sure physiological way in which shooting someone stops him is blood loss, depriving the brain and muscles of oxygen and nutrients, thus impairing the ability of the brain and muscles to function. Blood loss is facilitated by 1. Large holes causing tissue damage. 2. Getting the holes in the right places to damage major blood vessels or blood-bearing organs. 3. Adequate penetration to get those holes into the blood vessels and organs which are fairly deep in the body. The problem is that blood loss takes time. People have continued to fight effectively when gravely, even mortally wounded. So things that can speed up blood loss, more holes, bigger holes, better placed holes, etc., help. So as a rule of thumb, more holes are better than fewer holes. Larger holes are better than smaller holes. Holes in the right places are better than holes in the wrong places. Holes that are deep enough are better than holes that are not. There are no magic bullets. There are no guarantees. And with regard to the issue of psychological stops, we want to go ahead and take a look at some other references here. And what we're going to do is, this is from a discussion on failure to incapacitate, and this is kind of a different data set when it comes to this. And it's referencing a study from Buckeye Arms, and with that URL, you can get there and you can read that for yourself. What they're referencing is that they say, take a look at 2 numbers: the percentage of people who did not stop, no matter how many rounds were fired into them, and the one-shot stop percentage. Now watch this. The lower caliber rounds, 22, 25, 32, had a failure rate that was roughly double that of the higher caliber rounds. That would make sense. The one-shot stop percentage, where I considered all hits anywhere on the body, trended generally higher as the round gets more powerful. This tells us a couple of things. In a certain fairly high percentage of shootings, people stop their aggressive actions after being hit with one round regardless of caliber or shot placement. These people are likely not physically incapacitated by the bullet. They just don't want to be shot anymore and they give up. Call it a psychological stop if you will. Any bullet or caliber combination will likely yield similar results in those cases, and fortunately for us, there are a lot of these psychological stops occurring. The problem we have is when we don't get a psychological stop. If our attacker fights through the pain and continues to victimize us, we might want a round that causes the most damage possible. In essence, we are relying on a physical stop rather than a psychological one. In order to physically force someone to stop their violent actions, we need to either hit him in the central nervous system, brain, or upper spine, or cause enough bleeding that he becomes unconscious. The more powerful rounds look to be better at doing this. There are two sets of data in Ellifritz's study, incapacitation and failure to incapacitate, and they present some contradictions. Considering the physiology of wounding, the data showing high incapacitation rates for light cartridges seems anomalous. Furthermore, those same light cartridges which show high rates of incapacitation also show high rates of failures to incapacitate. In addition, heavier cartridges which show incapacitation rates comparable to the lighter cartridges nonetheless show lower failure to incapacitate rates. And note that the failure to incapacitate rates of the 9mm Luger, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, and 44 Magnum were comparable to each other. Interesting. Failure to incapacitate rates of the 9mm, 40, 45, and 44 Magnum comparable to each other. Folks, that one must get all of our attention, in my opinion, because that is putting the importance back on those fundamentals at the top of this page that we first started with. If the point of the exercise is to help choose cartridges best suited to self-defense application, it would be helpful to resolve those contradictions. A way to try to resolve those contradictions is to better understand the mechanisms by which someone who has been shot is caused to stop what he is doing, the two data sets and the apparent contradiction between them, and as Ellifritz wrote, thus strongly suggest that there are two mechanisms by which someone who has been shot will be caused to stop what he is doing. One mechanism is psychological. This was alluded to by both Ellifritz and FBI agent and firearms instructor Yuri Patrick. Sometimes the mere fact of being shot will cause someone to stop. When this is the stopping mechanism, the cartridge used really does not matter. One stops because his mind tells him to, because he's been shot, not because of the amount of damage of the wound has been done to the body. The other mechanism, physiological. If the body suffers sufficient damage, the person will be forced to stop what he is doing because he will be physiological incapable of continuing. Heavier cartridges with large bullets making bigger holes are more likely to cause more damage to the body than lighter cartridges. Therefore, if the stopping mechanism is physiological, lighter cartridges are more likely to fail to incapacitate. And in looking at any population of persons who were shot and therefore stopped what they were doing, we could expect that some stopped for psychological reasons. We could also expect others would not be stopped psychologically and would not stop until they were forced to because their bodies became physiologically incapable of continuing. From that perspective, the failure to incapacitate data is probably more important. That essentially tells us that when Plan A, a psychological stop, fails, we must rely on Plan B, a physiological stop, to save our bacon, and a heavier cartridge would have a lower failure rate. Also see the FBI paper entitled Handgun Wounding Factors. Agent Patrick, for example, notes on page 8, psychological factors are probably the most important relative to achieving rapid incapacitation from a gunshot wound to the torso. Awareness of the injury. Now watch this. This is getting to where a larger caliber, yes, it could make a difference, but it will make a difference. What he's saying here, I think, is it's going to make a difference because the assailant will understand they've been shot. They may not be physiologically incapacitated, but the awareness of the injury may be higher. So he says awareness of the injury, fear of death, blood, or pain, intimidation by the weapon or the act of being shot, or the simple desire to quit can all lead to rapid incapacitation, even from minor wounds. However, psychological factors are also the primary cause of incapacitation failures. The individual may be unaware of the wound and thus have no stimuli to force a reaction. Strong will, survival instinct, or sheer emotion such as rage or hate can keep a grievously wounded individual fighting. And for some, more insight into wound physiology and stopping power, we take a look, as quoted in Defense of Self and Others, Yuri Patrick. He cites, in the case of low velocity missiles, example, pistol bullets, the bullet produces a direct path of destruction with very little lateral extension within the surrounding tissue. This is a lot of what we saw, difference between the long guns and the handguns in our tests, and it was the difference in really the lateral disturbance or disruption in the test media. And it continues, only a small temporary cavity is produced to cause significant injuries to a structure. A pistol bullet must strike that structure directly. The amount of kinetic energy lost in the tissue by a pistol bullet is insufficient to cause the remote injuries produced by a high velocity rifle bullet. So what he is saying there is that's the reason why our test media stayed on the table and did not just completely explode with a handgun round as comparable to the rifle and the shotgun rounds. These have the ability to not only to make a disruptive hole, but also to destroy tissue laterally as it's doing that. And you pull back from that, and you lose some of that when it's going down to a 3 or 4 or 5 inch barrel. Okay, one other contributor just after that post gave some two rules that I thought were very appropriate. Rule number 1: terminal ballistics is an inexact science. Rule number 2: what you are shooting, the target, is as important as what you are shooting, that being the bullet. And I would suggest that both of those, the target and the bullet, are as important as what type of handgun you may be shooting that bullet out of towards whatever target that is. Folks, we wanted to just interrupt here. We wanted to cover this. Hopefully you have gotten some additional understanding out of it. If you're like me, you might run back and listen to this and go through this information more than once. I did. What did I mainly get out of this? What I got out of this was support for one particular friend of BHSpringSolutions, who I'll give credit to anonymously, who I do remember years and years and years ago when I was, reading all kinds of, differences of opinion and why are these, different calibers and different, brands of ammunition and different, loadings and what are all these for? And he said something that I didn't ever forget, actually, and he just shared it with us again recently. Big holes going fast. That's what I got out of this study. I'm going to say most of all is when it comes to handguns, big holes going fast seem to have advantages over ones that are not as big and or not as fast. Okay, folks, we are going to go to who won that 11 caliber shootout. Which caliber? Which one did you think? We're going to get back to that in just a moment. Okay, folks, the moment of truth. Who won this 11 caliber shootout? Before we go headlong into that, hopefully you are understanding that handgun calibers are kind of always a trade-off if you're comparing them to a projectile shot from a higher velocity tool like a rifle or a shotgun. we have established that big holes going fast seem to have an advantage, and that kind of gives us a little bit of a hint here. These are what we started out with, ordered in diameter of the projectile from smallest to largest. You'll remember we reordered those after we chronographed each of our test ammunitions. We calculated the foot-pounds of energy, and then I reordered these into based on the foot-pounds of energy of the particular caliber and the ammunition that we were testing, and they showed up in this order. And as I was reviewing all of the explosions and the impacts into the test media, I was really thinking especially about those top 3, top 4 on this list that you're looking at right here. And what I decided is I decided, I'm going to leave them in this order, watch all these one more time, and I'm going to see, does anything provide a truly compelling reason for us to change this order? Because certainly the 357 SIG round into the test media, it was quite persuasive, and it did. The penetration seemed good. The destruction going through the exit wound, everything seemed just a little superior to that of the 10 millimeter of the 40 Smith & Wesson. However, I do want to say this, and I'm not just taking a punt here. I would feel reasonably well served by several of these calibers in several of the handguns that we found these in. Probably I would not, run and be choosing the 32 ACP. However, it's 100% better than nothing, and if that's what I had, I would be getting as proficient with it as I could be. I think the 9x18 Makarov did not perform as robustly as I had kind of expected it to. I think it belongs in this list where it landed, and the capacity in the Makarov doesn't make a compelling case, for the round for me. So I probably wouldn't be looking at that one as my go-to. Everybody was reasonably impressed, actually, by the performance of the 380 ACP. Now, I do want to remind you that's out of almost a 4-inch barrel, and that's not a Ruger LCP. And it's a different ballistics day for the 380 ACP out of almost twice the length of barrel. The 30 Luger, it was a solid performer, no question. I do think that the 30 Super Carry did slightly outperform the 30 Luger. And I don't think that any of these 4 that we see here below the 30 Super Carry, I don't think any of those 4 made a compelling enough case for them to land higher than the 30 Super Carry, so we went with that. Had the 9x19 millimeter, and this one here is one of the ones that just made more questions, and the reason why we are not going to stop this study quite yet was this one. We had lower foot-pounds of energy than what we had expected out of this Browning 147 grain X-Point particular ammunition, but we had less out of all of them, frankly. So it's not a pick on the Browning, but on the 9 millimeter, it kind of disadvantages it a little bit when we get into this diameter of a bullet and this feet per second and that energy rating. It's a performer. It's not the shock and awe performer that the 357 SIG or the 40 was, or the 10 millimeter in this particular instance. It's one of the things that did make more questions, and we'll give you a hint about what we're going to do next. Okay, the 38 Super. It did seem to perform slightly more destructively than the 9 millimeter, although this would be extremely marginal. There was not a compelling reason to put the 9x19 above the 38 Super, though. The 45 ACP, this was insufficient penetration. Reason why it stays here in the number 4 position. of those top four, it was the least penetrating. Now, I want to again remind everybody watching this and listening that penetration is one of those other subjects that my goodness, how do you get that right? You obviously, in a lot of situations, you do not want to over penetrate. You don't want stopping a threat to have an injury or death implication for an innocent bystander who may be downrange from that assailant who needs to get handled. You don't need to kill the neighbor's dog in the apartment next door to defend your own apartment. On the other hand, insufficient penetration is also not desirable. So, folks, I want you to try to understand what an incredible fine line, situationally, we're talking about here about this subject of penetration. We used a smaller dimension test media for the penetration part of our test. We wanted to see that round exit the media, and if it did not exit the media, that was kind of a negative for that particular caliber on that particular day. So I did not feel like any of these rounds made a compelling enough case to go above the 45 ACP, and quite honestly, this particular ammunition also puts another degree of support behind this basic fundamental: big holes going fast. The 45 ACP, obviously the biggest hole of all of the calibers. That's the reason why it gets so far up the list here. However, 858 feet per second is not going fast. It's the slowest bullet that we tested, and in this case, I think it did keep the 45 ACP from being a little bit more competitive with the three that are above it. I did not feel like the 45 ACP made a compelling enough case to be in the top three or better than the 40, the 10 millimeter, and the 357 SIG. And guys, these three right here, I think we can all agree, these were extremely solid performance. There's not a lot negative to say about how any of these three performed. I did not see and believe that there was anything compelling enough in the 10 millimeter or the 40 Smith & Wesson's performance to put it as above the 357 SIG. But I want to tell you, we could almost put this one, the 10 millimeter, and maybe even that 40 Smith & Wesson in this case, almost put them in the same position almost. You do have more velocity with the 357 SIG, less bullet weight, less diameter. You add weight, add diameter, slow it down, and these sort of become, I guess you'd say, compensating factors, if you will. And it really, in my opinion, I mean, these two are very, very, very comparable in terms of what they accomplished with our test media. And the 40 Smith & Wesson was this was an impacting round. I mean, there's no denying that. It almost took the test media clear off the table, and it had impact. And so this is the way that we ordered them. However, as I said, and here's the reason why I'm saying this makes more questions. The questions primarily that this is making for me is, what is the real feet per second? What's the real foot-pounds of the energy that we're being sold these days? It says one thing on the box. Don't really get that same thing, in practice. And not putting a knock on anybody or any manufacturers, mind you. We're just looking for accuracy in our data. We're going to be coming back, and we're going to be answering more questions in just a moment.